Welcome back, guys. So today I have a news I want to tell you guys. I just realized that every day I study, but I don't think it's enough. Like I can study for like 4 hours, probably 3 to 4 hours, but I can play games a lot more. And in my current condition, I don't think it's the right thing to do. I know I know I still need to keep my sanity in check. Like I need to stay strong, right? For whatever's happening in my life right now. There's a lot of things that happened recently, and yeah, I need to stay strong. But I realized that I need to study harder and I need to work harder. I don't know if I can do it or not. It's not about me can do it or not. It's about like me must, like I must do it to survive. So yeah, this is like kind of a gloomy opening. Like no one will really watch this anyway, but it's fine. It's for my, yeah, when in the future I see this, I might like laugh at this and then, or I might like thank to myself. I don't know. But what I need is, I need to actually work harder. Oh, that is exactly what I'm going to do. So without further ado, let's do this first thing first on the day. Speed up time. Yeah, guys, that's it for today's progress. It's coming up nicely. Surely it's gonna be done soon, right? There is still a really long way to go. But yeah, I'm gonna continue learning. I'll see you guys. I'll stop recording first, guys. I'm on such low energy today, so I'm not gonna talk much. I know, like when you're learning, you need energy, right? And if you're talking, it makes you feel better. Like I'm currently talking to no one but myself. Day 13. Let's just start, I guess. I need to work hard. I need to keep my discipline up, and yeah, I'll do it, man. I'll do it. I know it's not gonna be easy, but I know I can do it. I'll start.
Press R, I dare you. Well, when you phrase it like that, that sounds like a challenge. So press R, I dare you. Well, when you phrase it like that, that sounds like a challenge. So that's a challenge I can't back down from. Whoa, what is happening right now? What is happening in this game, bro? Oh my god, I need to get out of here. This is too insane. All right, so that just happened. Yeah, the purpose of that, whatever that thing was with the sky, whatever I was doing, that was supposed to represent user input service, I guess. So it's basically how we're able to detect user input from the player whenever we're making Roblox games. So an input could be if I'm clicking my mouse in the game, if I'm pressing W to move forward, if I'm just pressing any sort of keys that are on the keyboard right now. You can actually see that in the output down here, it's detecting every time I do any sort of input that is just going to print the certain input. That is we're able to detect when the player is pressing down on a key on whatever device that they're playing on. So for me, I'm playing on a computer, but let's say I was playing on a mobile device, then we would probably detect when the player is moving or pressing the jump button, or just pressing buttons on an Xbox controller or PS4 controller now that Roblox is on PS4. So things like that. And I want to be able to introduce this concept in Roblox video so that you will know how to detect user input and also create the best experience for players depending on the device that they are playing on. So if that interests you, then you should stick around to the end of this video. So that being said, let's go straight into implementing. All right, let's think about this for a minute. You can see that with user input service, the thing we're going to be talking about this episode, there's so much to uncover with this concept that I'm going to be here forever if I'm going to try and go through every single thing that's inside this documentation. So what I'm going to do in this episode is give you a general introduction to how you can use user input service to get user input and also configure your game depending on what device the user is playing on. I'm going to treat this episode as an introduction more than an in-depth guide compared to some of my other episodes. And maybe in the future I will dive deeper into some of these concepts in specific videos. But for the purposes of this episode, I'm just going to go over some basic stuff for user input service, and hopefully you will be able to experiment with user input service on your own time, or stay with me for future videos where I talk more deeply into some of these concepts with user input service. So with that being said, let's now go and start implementing this in Roblox video. Now that we understand it, let's add user input into our game. There's two important use cases to use user input service, at least for the sake of this video, where the first one is detecting user input. So if they're pressing down a button while they're playing the game and just things like that. The second use case is detecting what device the player is playing on so that we can give them the best experience depending on what they're playing on. Because obviously, when a player's playing on a mobile device, the experience is a lot different than playing on a PC. So that's something we're going to have to detect in our game using user input service. And before we start adding it, you might ask, does this belong in a script or a local script? So user input service is only local sided. This cannot be done on the server. This can only be done from the player directly. So you're going to have to put this in a local script, probably somewhere that fits it best, like starter character scripts. So let's hit the plus sign next to starter character scripts and let's insert a local script. So let's delete this. And first thing we'll do is make to user input service. We're going to say local user input service equals game colon get service user input service. So the first part of this video is just detecting user input whenever they press down on any key. This is going to use a function called input began and input service. So the first part of this video is just detecting user input whenever they press down on any key. This is going to use a function called input began, and this is pretty much what it's going to look like. So we're going to say user input service dot input began colon connect function open and close parentheses, enter. So this input began event takes in two function parameters. The first one is the user input, and then the other one is a Boolean that's called game processed event. I'm going to go over what this one does in a little bit, but for now we're going to focus on the input which is basically an input object made by Roblox themselves that contains information that tell us what type of input the user is currently pressing down on when this event fires. So if we were to not pay attention to the input and just simply do something whenever the user does anything related to user input, let's just make a print statement really quickly just to see whether this is working or not. So we'll just simply say input, and then let's see what this looks like when we play the game. So in the game, I can literally do anything to make it so that the input began event will fire. I can right click and it will say input hasn't printed down here. I can move around and it'll constantly print out input because I'm pressing down on multiple keys while I'm moving my character. If I jump or just like really press anything on my keyboard, then it's going to activate the input began event. And this basically applies with any input that I do. So not only is this going to work with keyboard and mouse, but this would also apply to if you're playing on a phone, a tablet, or even on an Xbox or PS4. Just any sort of input will be detected using the input began. But this is important to note when we're pressing down on a key and not when we're lifting it back up. I'm going to show you how we're going to detect that in a little bit. So let's go back to our script, and we can see that this is basically being printed anytime we press any input. So it doesn't really matter what input it is, as long as we're pressing down something. But now let's say we wanted to focus on specifically which input we want to look out for whenever we're pressing down a key. So let's say we want the player to press a specific key, then we want it to do something once we know that we press something. So with my very weird example from the beginning where I pressed R and that specifically triggered something, we can do that using this input that was passed in to check whether this input was specifically R. So we're going to do that down here by dropping 2 lines, and we're just going to do a simple if statement. We're just going to say if input. Now, the thing about input is that this is an input object, and it has multiple properties that are layered onto this input object. The thing we're most interested in is the key that was pressed. So this property is called key code, which is an enum value, which describes the kind of input that is being pressed from the user. So this is how we're going to detect whether the input is the one we're looking for. It's not just input because input is an object. We're looking for the key code property. So then we're going to say if this is equal to R. So we can do it like this as a character, but the more conventional way of doing this is by using an enum value from key code. So you know how key code is an enum value? We want this to match a key code enum that exists in Roblox's library. Already. So we're going to do that by saying enum.keycode. And as you can see, there's a whole list of options that we can choose from using this keycode enum. Now, keycode is a specific thing for certain keyboards, so this will not work for devices such as phones, tablets, and consoles. This is specifically for keyboards. So let's say we want it to be R. Then we're going to say print player has pressed R. So this is the syntax we're going to use to figure out whether the player has pressed down the R key using the key code enum from our user input. So let's go into the game and try this out. All right, so over here, I'm just spamming my keyboard to print input, but I'm not pressing R yet. Now, when I do press R, you can see that in the output, it says player has pressed R because we made a check to see if the key code is equal to R specifically. Then we're going to execute whatever's down here and not just any random input that we set out input began to detect. So that pretty much works as expected. So I mentioned that input began has 2 arguments. So we have the input, and then we have this random boolean called game process event. What is this? So let's first write down what actually happens when we do check whether this game process event is true or not. So let's just simply write if game processed event, then print game processed event. Now let's go into the game so I can demonstrate to you what this does. All right, so I'm in the game. Let's say, for instance, I want to type something in the chat for whatever reason. So I'm going to press the chat, and then I'm just going to type in rat. I don't know, just like something completely random. Obviously, if I have a local script that's detecting user input, I needed to press down the RAT key to be able to type out this message. But what if I don't want to detect this user input while the user is just typing something in the chat? That's basically what game process event is. We're seeing whether the player is currently interacting with Roblox's GUI system, or I believe any GUI in general, as a matter of fact. I could be wrong about that. With certain interactions like this, especially with the chat, we don't all of a sudden want it to do what it needs to do with this script if, let's say, the player is chatting something using Roblox's GUI. That's where we detect with game process event. If the player is currently interacting with Roblox's GUI system, then we don't want to do the user input checking. So that's why in most cases, we would just simply return this input began event, because if, let's say, the user is typing something in the chat, we don't want to process this input began event. We just want to simply return this with no issues whatsoever. And that's basically what game process event is. I hope that makes sense to you. All right, so we have an event for input began, which is basically when the player presses down on a key. But now let's try making another event to detect when the player lifts the key back up. We will do that using an event called input ended. So down here, the syntax is relatively similar-ish. So we're going to say user input service dot input ended colon connect function open parentheses, close parentheses, input, and then game processed event. And this will pretty much fire whenever the player lifts a key off of the keyboard, or any input in general. So we're gonna say user has lifted the input. And so we can go into the game and see this change anytime I press down a key and then lift it back up. So I'm going to hold the left mouse button. So I'm going to press the left mouse button. It still says the input is down there, but then when I let go, it says the user has lifted the input. So this pretty much happens whenever we just let go of any sort of key. So I'm currently pressing S. If I let go, then it's gonna say user has lifted the input. And this can be done for every single input began and input ended. So that's one quick little thing I wanted to introduce there to get you familiar with that. So over here, we detected user input based on the key that they were pressing on the keyboard. But obviously there's way more different types of input other than just keys on the keyboard, like my mouse or a gamepad or mobile, things like that. We can do that using another property of input, not called key code, but called user input type. And this is what it's going to look like. So let's detect if the player is pressing the left mouse button. We're going to do that by typing if input.user input type equals, and this is going to be another enum value. So we're going to say enum.user input type dot, and there's a whole bunch of options here. So mouse button 1 is basically our left mouse button, and then there's mouse button 2, which is our right mouse button, and then mouse button 3, which is like a little mouse scroll wheel if you press that down. And then there's a bunch of other stuff too that we're not really going to worry too much about as of right now. So we're going to say mouse button 1, then print user is, and then there's mouse button 2. 2, which is our right mouse button, and then mouse button 3, which is like the little mouse scroll wheel if we press that down. And then there's a bunch of other stuff too that we're not really going to worry too much about as of right now. So we're going to say mouse button 1, then print user is pressing the left mouse button. And so if we try this out in game, this is how we're going to detect mouse clicks in our game. So I'm going to hit the left mouse button, and it's going to say user is pressing the left mouse button, and this will only work with the left one. If I try pressing the right one, it's not going to print the left mouse button, or if I even press the middle button, it's not going to say left mouse button. Mouse button 1 is specifically the left mouse button. And so that's pretty much how that works. We can do the same thing with mouse button 2, mouse button 3, and we can also do this with different device inputs as well. We can say touch, which basically means that the user is on a touch device. So like a mobile device like an iPhone or a tablet, this is how we can detect that using this. And even a gamepad as well. So usually it would be gamepad 1 if we're just detecting player 1 on like an Xbox or a PS4. This is how we detect that. It's pretty much one way way of detecting the type of user input just by using user input type when we're checking this in our input began event. So this was one way of detecting the user input type of whether the user is playing on a phone, a tablet, a console, things like that. But there's actually an easier way to do this without doing this if statement check inside of this input began event, because user input service has these properties that automatically tell us whether the user is playing on a specific device. So these properties are usually named after the device that they're playing on. So touch enabled is telling us if the player is on a mobile device. Gamepad enabled is if we're playing on a console and things like that. It's pretty simple actually. So let's drop 2 lines up here to make a check whenever the player joins into the game to see what device they're playing on. We're just simply going to say if user input service dot touch enabled. So this one tells us if the user's device has a touch screen. So this is usually for mobile phones. We're going to then say print player is playing on a mobile device. And we can do something cool with this as well to really show us the difference. So we're going to say workspace colon wait for child base plate, and we're going to put in wait for child so that it can load in fast enough. Dot color equals color3 dot from RGB. We're probably going to do some blue color. Hit OK, and then let's go into the game and try this out. All right, so we're in the game, and as you can see, the base plate colors dot from RGB. We're child a mobile device. We're going to put in wait for child so that it can load in fast enough. Dot color equals color3 dot from RGB. We're probably going to do some blue color. Hit OK, and then let's go into the game and try this out. All right, so we're in the game, and as you can see, the base plate dot from RGB. We're probably going to do some blue color. Hit OK, and then let's go into the game and try this out. All right.
Mm.
So we're in the game, and as you can see, the base plate color has changed to blue because we are playing on a phone. If I were to back out of this and then get off of device emulations, play on my PC, then this change should not happen since I'm now playing on a PC. So yeah, because now that I'm playing on a PC, the script is not going to tell me that I'm playing on a mobile device in order to change the base plate's colors. So we were able to do that successfully, and we can do this with console as well, just by simply replacing touch enabled with gamepad enabled. And we can also do this with VR as well if you're playing Roblox VR, just by saying VR enabled. So these properties can pretty much signify whether the player is playing on a specific kind of device, and you can use this property from user input service to do specific things with the player experience, like changing GUIs to fit the player's screen better, or modify GUI screens, or modify user controls based on the device that they're playing on. And another instance I can think of that this would be very useful for is if you're using tools, where the tool will play out differently depending on the device that you're playing on, because a lot of the times tools require different controls for different devices that the user's playing on. You're not going to be able to press W, A, S, and D if you're on a mobile phone, and this is especially true for tools if you're trying to press specific keys that you're not able to on a different device. So that's something else I wanted to throw in there. User input service also allows us to detect when the player is jumping using an event called jump request. So this is what it's going to look like if we just go down here and then say user input service. Dot jump request. And this is basically going to fire every single time the player wants to make a request that are jumping, also known as pressing the spacebar, or pressing the jump button or A button, whatever device that they're playing on, just making any request that makes the player jump. We're gonna say connect function, open parentheses, close parentheses. This one has no arguments, so we can just hit enter. And now we can just print something like player has jumped. You might think that this is basically the only thing we need to do, but that's actually not correct, because let's say we do try playing the game and try to make a jump request. Let's see what happens in the output when we do try and jump. So I'm gonna hit spacebar, and down here it said the player has jumped, but I only pressed spacebar one time, but for some reason this printed 3 times. And if I try this again, I press spacebar, it's continuously printing 3 or 4 different times, maybe even more every time I just press the spacebar button. This especially happens when I'm holding down the spacebar, when it's just printing like this many times. The reason it's doing that is because the event is detecting when a jump request is happening, and a jump request can pretty much happen every millisecond that we try and attempt this jump request. So an easy solution to this is to wrap this in a debounce boolean variable. So up here we can just write a very quick boolean by saying local is jumping equals false. And then down here we can make a check by saying if not is jumping. Then we will set is jumping equal to true, and then we're going to take our print statement and then put it in here. And then what we'll do is put a task.wait statement over here, like maybe about 0.5 seconds, and then set is jumping back to false. So when the player does decide to jump, then we will make the script wait for a little bit before setting is jumping back to false, so that we can make the jump request check again. And this should pretty much prevent our issue that we had before. All right, so I'm going to hit jump, and it says the player has jumped. So if I keep holding it, then it's going to print player has jumped whenever my character gets back down bit before setting is jumping back to false, so that we can make the jump request check again. And this should pretty much prevent our issue that we had before. All right, so I'm going to hit jump, and it says the player has jumped. So if I keep holding it, then it's going to print player has jumped whenever my character gets back down on the ground to then print it again in the output. So it pretty much now works as expected. This is very useful if we're trying to detect when the player's jumping, of course, and that is pretty much the end of that. What if we wanted to detect multiple key presses? There's actually a couple ways we can do this, but the easiest way I know is by using a function inside of input began whenever we press a new key. And this function is called isKeyDown. So we can use this function to tell whether the player is currently holding down this key alongside this new key that they just pressed down. So we can probably do that by modifying this if statement right here with our input began. So what if we wanted to hold the keys R and Q at the exact same time? We can pretty much do this by first checking whether the player is already holding down the Q key, and we can fire this down here when the new input the player is pressing down on is R. Right before this, we're gonna say if user input service colon is key down, and this takes in a key code parameter. So we're going to say enum.keycode.q, and then what we're going to do is put an and here, so that we're going to say if the q key is currently being being pressed down right now, and then our new input is going to be R, then we're going to print player has pressed R while holding Q. And so that's pretty much how we're going to detect whether multiple keys are being pressed at the same time. So let's hit play and see what happens. All right, so I'm pressing R, and as you can see, nothing's being printed right now because I need to hold Q first. So let's hold Q, and then let's press R. So now it says player has pressed R while holding Q. So that is pretty much how we detect multiple keys at the same time. So now that we bring up the idea of pressing multiple keys, what if we want to do a double tap on a key? We pretty much do this using a feature called tick, which I don't expect you to know about because we never talked about this yet. But just for the sake of this example, you can follow what I do. But for a basic explanation, tick is basically a feature that lets us keep track of time in our script. What if, let's say, we wanted to detect whether a player is double tapping W to do some sort of cool functionality with it? We can first do that by creating an if statement down here, saying if input.keycode equals enum.keycode.w, then print player has double pressed W. Now, obviously, if we do this, this is just one input of W, not double pressing, because we want to have the double press happen during a specific window of time so that it would count as a double press. So double press would probably be like if we press W once and then press W twice, we want to have it in the span of like 0.5 seconds or something so that we can make it count as a double press and not just a single press. So up here, let's write a tick variable by saying local current tick equals tick, open and close parentheses. And then down here in our if statement, let's say and current tick minus tick is less than or equal to 0.2. Let's make it 0.2 in this case. And let's also wrap this condition in a parentheses so that we don't get confused with it. And then down here, let's write current tick equals tick open close parentheses. So this is pretty much how we would be able to track in time whether the player is double pressing W or just pressing W singularly. If it passes 0.2 seconds in between when we press W. Oops, I made a little typo here, my bad. So it's tick first and then then minus current tick. My apologies on that. Let's play the game. All right, so I'm pressing W and nothing's being printed. If I press it again, nothing's being printed. If I double press it, then it's going to say player has double pressed W because we very quickly pressed W within the span of under 0.2 seconds or exactly at 0.2 seconds. So let's press it again. Nothing's being printed. Press it again. Nothing's being printed. And it's still not printing. So let's rapid tap it. And now it says player has double pressed W. So it's very quick. And obviously we can adjust this duration by changing this number from 0.2 to maybe 0.5 to make it more lenient. But you get the general idea. I don't expect you to know about tick until we discuss about it in a whole other video, but this is one way of detecting whether a player is double tapping on a key. I think that'll pretty much wrap up the introduction to user input service. It's a very big feature that Roblox has, and I encourage you to go and try some of these other functions and events and all sorts of stuff on the API that Roblox has provided for you. It's a very big concept to know about because user input is one of the most fundamental things that that scripts can do when making the best experience possible in the games that you're playing. If you made it this far into the video, then I encourage you to watch my other videos on my advanced scripting tutorial playlist, or just check out any of my other videos that I have on my channel. But with that being said, that's pretty much where I'm going to end it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to join my Discord server. The links in description, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care. Ooh, damn, that's a pretty nice looking car over there. I don't even know what it's doing out here in the middle of nowhere, but I don't think it would hurt if I tried to take this out for a spin. All right, let's see if I can get on this car. All right. Ooh, this is pretty nice. This is pretty nice. Let's see if I can take this for a spin. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is driving by pretty nice. Oh, I'm doing a little cartwheel over there. Okay. It's a little too chaotic, but let's see. Does this car have any other features? Can I like turn on the lights? Can I honk the horn? Let's see if I can try honking the horn. Maybe it'll probably be the H key. Let's try that. Uh, all right, let's think about what just happened for a minute. So I was in this car, and I was able to press the H key to honk the horn and also make it explode, apparently. But what matters is that context is what mattered when it came to pressing the H key, because I had to literally be in the car in order to press the H key. If I was out here pressing the H key, then nothing will happen because I'm not in the right context of sitting down in this car, being in the driver's seat, and being able to honk the horn. That's inside this car. So if I
Rest for a while. Hello guys, it's been like 2 or 3 hours. I'm gonna continue learning. I'll save this first. It's no publish. Oh, okay. Is day Wait, is today day 13? Yeah, today is day 13. Okay, let's continue.
Go into this car, and then I try driving around. Now that I'm in the driver's seat with the right context, I can then press the H key to do that, I guess, to honk the horn and make it explode. So this only happens when I'm in the car, and that's the only time I can press the H key. I'm pretty sure if I was in the car and then I stepped out of the car, then there would be no functionality with pressing the H key again. This only happens in the context of me being in the driver's seat of the car. And when I stepped out of the car, I was no longer able to do the action of pressing the H key to honk the horn. And so that's pretty much what this is. This kind of seems like a continuation from my user input service video that I made previously. And that is essentially what this is. This is user input service, but this time we're adding context to when the player can press down a certain input or key or whatever it may be in order to do things with certain actions. So with that being said, now let's get to implementing this inside of a Roblox game. Now that we understand it, let's start implementing user input during specific context that matters most when we need to. So how we're going to do this is we're going to use a local script, much like we did in user input service, to be able to detect user input. And this is a local sided only feature. So let's go to the right side in starter player and starter character scripts, and let's hit the plus sign to add a new local script. So
Oh, player is brain, character is body. Oh, player the client, character the avatar. Character script every time the character spawns or respawn. Okay. Global client. Action. Seven script to control an auto clicker. Translation. Okay.
So let's delete this and let's first make reference to our new service called context action service. This is what we're going to be using. So we're going to say local context action service equals game colon get service. Context action service. All right, and so for right now, I'm going to show you a really basic example of detecting user input based on a function that context action service provides. Action service. Context action service equals game colon get service. context action service. All right, and so for right now, I'm going to show you a really basic example of detecting user input based on a function that context action service provides, and this is going to be called bind action. So we need to be able to define what function that needs to be executed when we press a certain key, and be able to make this key pressable to do a certain action. So we're going to do that by saying context action service colon bind action, and this takes in roughly about 4 parameters. So the first one is the action name. And this is pretty much what we're going to name the action. When we press a certain key or have some sort of specific input, we're going to call this pressed E. And then for our second argument, we're going to pass in a function that will execute this action when we do the action that we specified, which in this case is going to be pressing E. So we're actually going to need to create a new function before we call bind action.
Mhm. Okay.
So let's drop 2 lines from the first line, and let's create a new function. We're going to call this local function press E, open and close parentheses, enter. Now, here's the interesting thing about bind action. When we pass in a function to bind for our second argument, it's going to pass in 3 arguments, but there's only really 2 that matters to us. And the first argument that it's going to automatically pass is going to be the action name itself. So we're going to call this parameter action name. And the second argument is basically going to be the state of the input. So state meaning, is the button being pressed down, is the button being let go, is it stagnated, things like that. So this is going to be the input state, and these are the two parameters that matter to us. Down is the button being call this parameter action that matters to us. Interesting thing about the first line, and let's create a new function. We're going to call this local function press E, open and close parentheses, enter. Now here's the interesting thing about bind action. When we pass in a function to bind for our second argument, it's going to pass in 3 arguments. But there's only really 2 that matters to us. And the first argument that it's going to automatically pass is going to be the action name itself. So we're going to call this parameter action name. And the second argument is basically going to be the state of the input. So state meaning, is the button being pressed down, is the button being let go, is it stagnated, things like that. So this is going to be the input state, and these are the two parameters. Is the button being pressed down, is the button being let go, is it stagnated, things like that. So this is going to be the input state of the input. So state the action name itself. So we're going to call this parameter action name. And the second argument is basically going to be the state of the input. So state meaning, is the button being pressed down, is the button being let go, is it stagnated, things like that. So this is going to be the input state, and these are the two parameters that matter to us. So in this function, we're going to do 2 checks to make sure that this action is valid. So the first thing we're going to do is check for the action name. So we're going to say if action name equals whatever our action name here is, which is pressed E. We can just say pressed E. And what we're also going to check is the type of the state of the input as well. So we want to do this when the player presses down on the E key. So we're going to say input state equals enum dot user input state dot, and as you can see, there's a whole bunch of options. There's about 5 options here. The one we're interested in is begin, which is when we press down on a key or whatever input that we're trying to give into the game. So we're going to say begin, then we can do whatever we want here, which in this case we can just write a simple print statement by saying player has pressed the E key. Okay, so now finally we can pass this press E function into our bind action function from context action service. So we'll just simply say press E, comma, and now we have a third argument here that's called create touch button. And this is basically asking, do you want to create a mobile button for the player if somebody is playing on a touch input device like an iPad or an iPhone, things like that. We're going to say true. And finally, the last argument, or infinite amounts of arguments after this, is however many keys you want this action to be valid. So in this case, let's make it the key E because that's what we're making this bind action function to be. We're going to activate this when the user presses the E key. So we're going to say enum.keycode.e. So this is basically the entirety of the bind action function that allows us to give a context of when we can allow the player to press the E key to then fire this function to print player has pressed the E key. I hope this makes sense. This is a very basic example. So let's go to the game and see how this would work in game. All right, so I've
And
load into the game, if I press E, then it's going to print down here player has pressed the E key. However, the problem here now is that this kind of just seems like normal user input service, and that's because we're missing the context part of it. There's no reason for us to just simply do this bind action function without providing it the context of when we should use the bind action function. This is just simply saying if the player joins the game or their character exists in the world, then we bind this function here. So there's no reason for us to do this because this action is going to bind no matter what we do, and we're kind of getting rid of the exists in the world, then we bind this function here. So there's no reason for us to do this because this action is going to bind no matter what we do, and we're kind of getting rid of the whole reason why we're using context action service in the first place. So what we can do is now provide context to our action that we created. And to further add on to this, there's another function that will be important to us later, but I'm going to show you it right now, and that's called unbind action. And this is basically saying if context action service has binded an action, which is our press E function, and we don't want the player to be able to press the E key anymore to run this, then we just simply say context action service unbind action. And this only takes in one parameter, and this only takes in one argument, which is the action name name itself. And as we remember, the action name here is simply called press E. So let's pass in press E as the argument. And now what this is saying is that when we join into the game, we're going to bind the action that the player can be able to press the E key, but then immediately right after that, we're just going to cancel this. So this script basically means nothing now because we're binding the action and then we're automatically unbinding the action right afterwards. So this is why context matters. And so that's why right now what we're about to do is add context to this to make context action service useful compared to user input service. All right, so I think a really good demonstration of adding context to our key presses is by having a tool where when the player equips the tool, then we're able to press down keys on it that we're not able to if we don't have the tool equipped. So let's create a tool on the right side by going to start pack, hitting plus sign, and let's create a tool. Now we'll do is we'll add a handle to it. So let's go to workspace, to press down keys on it that we're not able to if we don't have the tool equipped. So let's create a tool on the right side by going to start pack, hitting plus sign, and let's create a tool. Now we'll do is we'll add a handle to it. So let's go to workspace, hit plus sign, create a part. And we're going to rename this part to handle, and let's drag this into our tool. So now let's create a local script inside here by hitting plus sign, create a local script. For our previous local script, let's actually disable create part, and we're going to rename this part to handle, and let's drag this into our tool. So now let's create a local script inside here by hitting plus sign, create a local script. For our previous local script, let's actually disable this so that this won't be in effect anymore. let's take context action service, copy it, paste it into here, and let's also copy our press E function, take it into here. But now what we'll do is we'll make it so that when we equip the tool, that's when we'll be able to press the E key with the given context. So let's make reference to our tool. So we're going to drop a line down here and say local tool equals script dot parent. And then what we're going to do is drop two lines down here and create two events. The first one being equipped. So we're going to say tool.equipped colon connect function, open and close parentheses, enter. And then we're going to do the same thing down here with unequipped. Connect function, open close parentheses, enter. Okay, so for equipped, we want to make it so that when the player has the tool equipped, then we will allow the player to press the E key. So we could go back to our old script, copy our bind action function right here, and then copy it into our equipped script, into our equipped event. And we can pretty much do the same thing with unbind as well by taking this and copying it and pasting it into our unequipped equipped. That way, when the tool is equipped, we can now provide the right context for the player to press the E key, and if the tool is unequipped, then we're able to unbind the action so that the player will no longer be able to press the E key since the player is not holding the tool anymore. So let's go into the game and see this for ourselves. All right, so as you can see, our tool is down here, but I currently don't have it equipped. So let's press E, and as you can see, nothing is happening when I press E. But now let's equip the tool and see what happens when I press E. So I press E, and now it says down here that player has pressed the E key. I can press this again and again and again and again, but then when I unequip it, the script is going to unbind the action. So when I press E again, then it's not going to print down here because I no longer have the right context to be able to press the E key. So this is how we provide context to our input, to our user input. It's by using context action service. And when you know how to use context action service, this is very effective for user interactivity and user input. Oh yeah, one quick thing I want to add is, so this is how we provide context to our input, to our user input. It's by using context action service. And when you know how to use context action service, this is very effective for user interactivity and user input. Oh yeah, one quick thing I want to add is, you know how I mentioned that for bind action, we basically have these three arguments right here, and then so when I press E again, then it's not our have these three arguments right here, and then after that, we basically have an infinite number of arguments that tell us how many inputs we want this to be valid for when we activate this function right here. So we can basically add more inputs if we want to, other than the E key. So we would just do that by separating it with a comma by saying comma enum.keycode. Let's say R. So now what we're doing is for this bind action press E function, we can make it activate by either pressing E or R. And if we want to add any third argument, we can say enum.keycode.t, and we can just keep going on and on. For however many inputs we want this pressed E action to fire from based on user input. So this is a little thing I wanted to add here in case you want to add multiple ways of input for the same exact action. So there's actually another function we can use to bind our actions when we need to do so. And this is going to be called bind action at priority. You might ask what that is. So when we bind actions, let's say for this case, we have bind action to press the E key in order to fire this function. But now let's say if we had another bind action that requires us to use this same E key. If we have an E key here and an E key here, then both of these will pretty much bind action to the E key. But what if we wanted to have an order of hierarchy of which bind to press whenever a specific bind action happens over the other one? This is when we have priority over our bind actions by telling us that if we have this bind action to press the E key for this, what if now we wanted to press the E key for something completely different, like a completely different function here that says press E to equip or something, or just a different action in general? We would do that using bind action at priority. There's this little hierarchy of what we want to do in this specific period when we press this certain key. We can do that by using this function, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. So let's get rid of this line over here. We're going to be saying context action service bind action at priority, and this basically has one additional argument, but for the first three, it's basically the same thing. So it's going to have our action name, which is going to be press E, and then it's going to have the function that we're going to pass in, which is just going to be press E, and then it's going to ask us whether we want to create a touch button. We're going to say true, and now we have our new argument, which is our priority level. I believe this is a number from 0 to 100. The higher the number is, the more priority that this has over the previous bind action. So if the default is 0, we can say 1 to have a higher priority over the previous one. And then finally, we can pass in any input that we want past this point. So we're going to say enum.keycode.e. Okay, so now we have our bind action at priority here that basically calls this function. But we're not done here yet because bind action will have priority over bind action at priority anyways, because we can basically treat regular bind action as if we're saying this bind action will have priority over bind action at priority anyways, because we can basically treat regular bind action as if we're saying this is going to have a priority of 100, like it's going to have the max, because it's not even associated with the priority because it's automatically going to have the biggest priority. So we actually need to replace this with a bind action at priority, and we need to add in a priority of 0 in the fourth argument. So now this is valid. Now we can say that this is going to give us the right results that we want to make this one valid over the previous one. So in order to tell whether this is actually working or not, let's create a new action name inside of our press E function. So we can basically drop 2 lines down here, and we can copy and paste our previous if statement and drop it down here. So let's say if the action name is press E to equip tool. So this will be our new action rather than just pressing E. We're going to say player has pressed the E key to equip the tool. And what we're going to do is we're going to replace our function name, the function, but this time we have a different action name for them. And when we press E down here, this one is going to have a higher priority over this one up here with regularly pressing E. So if we press E, it's not going to go to the one that's in here, but instead it's going to go to the one that's down here because this one has a higher priority over the previous one when we press the same key. So I really hope that makes sense to you. If it didn't, I encourage you to rewatch this part of the video about bind action at priority, because this is something very important to understand. So let's go to the game now and see our change. All right, so let's equip our tool down here and let's press the E key. So as you can see, player has pressed the E key to equip the tool because we're saying that this one has a higher priority when we press the E key, not the one that's over here. So that's why we're going to skip this one that's over here and go to this if statement instead with this action specifically. If we switch the priority numbers around, so if let's say with the regular press down here, because now this one should have a higher priority over the second one. So now it just says player has pressed the E key. So that is pretty much how bind action at priority works, and I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, now you might wonder about the whole create touch button thing that I've been talking about with bind action up until this point. So I'm going to show you what this create touch button actually is right now. But the first thing we're going to do is comment the second line here with bind action at priority. And what we will do is we're going to go into the game and we're going to hit test with device emulation. Let's play on some sort of touch device like an iPhone 14 Pro. So let's hit play now and see what the game looks like when we're equipping our tool to be ready to press the E key. Now, what I just said doesn't seem to really make sense because on a touch screen, obviously there's no E key. So what does Roblox decide to do instead? Well, they pretty much just make a button for you to press rather than having to press the E key, because as you know, an E key does not exist on a mobile device or any sort of touch device. So let's equip the tool. And as you can see, Roblox has placed down a little button for us to press rather than having to press the E key as we defined here when we set create touch button to true, because we told Roblox that we wanted to create a button that replaces the need to press the E key if we're on mobile. So if we press this, then it should say player has pressed the E key because this is the only thing that's being called here. It's this action name right here. But this button looks kind of basic. It doesn't have any labels. It's not colorful or anything like that. It's just a basic default button that Roblox has created for us. So now I'm going to show you how to customize this button for touch devices. So for button customization, there's 3 events. There are 3 functions that I think are important to know about. Now, obviously, there's more that you can look at when you go to the documentation for context action service. But for this episode, I'm going to be showing you 3 of them that I think are important. So let's drop a line down here right after we bind our function for press E. So we're going to change the way the button looks for this specific action, press E. So the way we're going to do that is by using 3 functions from context action service. So we're going to say context action service colon, and the first one I'm going to show you is changing the title of the button. So what I mean by title is if we, let's say, had the button right here, it's going to have a text on it to let us know what this button does. So that's what the title is, and we're going to set that title. So in our script, let's say set title, and then in parentheses, this takes in 2 arguments. The first one is going to be the action name, which in this case, it's going to be pressed E. So that's our action name right here. And then it's going to take in this, a second argument, which is going to be the title itself as a string. We're just going to say press E. Just like something random like this, just to let the player know that this is what the button does, so that we can overlay this text in front of the button. So that's one of them. The second one is set image, and this is basically saying we can add a image from the Roblox marketplace to basically slap it onto our button to give us more of a visual representation of the button by just slapping an image onto the actual button. So the way we find an image is, if you remember, it's from the toolbox, which one way you can find it is in view, and then toolbox over here. We can then select an image from the image library. In this case, let's take this red valve decal. So we're going to click it and hit copy asset ID, and then let's go into our script. So we're going to say context action service colon set image. And the first thing with this set of strings right here, and then our image ID that we copied from our red Valve decal, so we're going to hit paste, and that's going to be our ID works. It basically starts with this set of strings right here. So in quotations, we're going to say exactly RBX asset ID colon //, and then our image ID that we copied from our red Valve decal, so we're going to hit paste, and that's going to be our number. So this is the entire image URL right here that's going to change the image of the button. So let's go into the game and see what this looks like now that we changed the behind it. It's kind of hard to see, but using set position. Now, first thing, so if you want to change the scale of this specifically, so basically structured like this, we're going to say udim2.new, open close parentheses, and it's going to take in 4 arguments. We're going to change the scale of this specifically, so we're going to probably put this somewhere in the middle of the screen just for the sake of this tutorial. We're going to say 0.5, comma 0, comma 0.5, 0. So now we change the position of the button to probably a better spot on the screen, or at least somewhere that's not in front of the jump button. So let's go into the game and see the result. Okay, so I had to fidget with the numbers around for a little bit to a number that's more representable, like -1 for the scale. So now that we're in the game and I equip the tool, we can see that now the button is at a position that's not where it used to be in front of the jump button. Now, obviously, you want to tinker around with this to make it at a much better place. You don't want to like have your thumb all the way over here and then you have to reach for this button with your fingers. It's not very convenient, but just for demonstration purposes, that's how you change the position of a button inside Roblox Studio with context action service. So I hope this serves to be very useful to you if you decide to use this in your Roblox game. And finally, what we will go over is changing the actual button image itself. So in order to know where this is located, we will go to Players Brawl Battle, player GUI, context action GUI, context button frame, and then finally we have the context action button to then see all players brawl use this in your Roblox game. And finally, what we will go over is changing the actual button image itself. So it serves to be very useful to you if you decide to use this in your Roblox game. And finally, what we will go over is changing the actual button image itself. So in order to know where this is located, we will go to Players Brawl Battle, player GUI, context action GUI, context button frame, and then finally we have the context action. Where this is located, we will go to Players Brawl Battle, player GUI, context action GUI, context button frame, and then finally we have the context action button to then see all these properties that we can change for an image button. I did not go over what image buttons are, but I will go over that later in my GUI tutorial guide. But just like properties that we can change for an image button. I did not go over what image buttons are, but I will go over that later in my GUI tutorial guide. But just letting you know that this is a image button instance that has all these properties that you can change in order to change the look of your button. So let's say I want to change the image color. So if I press this and then change the image color, I can change it to have it to be a tint of, let's say, blue. So now the image has like this bluish color to it. And we can even have an image transparency of it to something different, like 0.5, so that it's a little bit harder to see, but it's not entirely opaque. So we can make these little modifications to the button itself if we want to by using a function that Roblox has provided to us called getButton. And I'm going to show you how to do this in your script. All right, so let's go into our local script. And down here, let's get our button. So we're going to say local button equals context action service colon get button. And we're going to pass in our action name, which is going to be pressed E. So now that we have our button, let's first check to see if this button exists, because obviously we want this to happen only if we're playing on a touch device. So you're gonna say if button then, and then we can change whatever we want to change with the button. So what I showed you before, we want this to happen only if we're playing on a touch device. So you're gonna say if button then, and then we can change whatever we want to change with the button. So what I showed you before, we changed the transparency of the button, and we also changed the color of it. So we can change the color of it here in our script by saying button.image color 3 equals color 3 dot from RGB, and then we can click this little wheel here, and then change it to, let's say, this blue color. Let's hit OK, and we can even change the image transparency as well by saying button.image transparency equals 0.5. So now if we go into the game, we can see that we've made changes to our button itself, because we were able to get the button from the context action service get button function. And as you can see, our button here is now blue, and it's also at 0.5 transparency. So this has basically worked as intended. There's one more thing I want to discuss before we end off the video. Now, unfortunately, there is an issue with changing the actual button itself, like this little circular default button here. If we open up the players, Brawl Battle, Starter GUI, context action service, context button, and the actual button itself. So before we leave this video, I want to show you something very interesting that I don't know if you've ever noticed, that if you've ever seen this before. But if we have this button image, we can see that it's an ID of 9716444, just like a bunch of random numbers here. If I press the button, then it's going to change the ID to something different. If I let go, then the ID is going to change back to 444. So if I press it, it's going to change the image to something that's a little bit brighter, and then let go, it's going to change it back to something else. So I actually tested this by changing the image to something completely different, like an actual button. So if I search a button, and let's say I took one of these buttons and tried replacing the image, it's just going to be overridden with Roblox's default system of just changing the ID to this default button. And unfortunately, I believe there's no way around this exactly. You're gonna have to use a different framework created by someone that allows you to change the actual button itself. There is a feature for that. I don't exactly know what the name of it is, but if you want to know what it is, I'll probably need to change to this default button. And unfortunately, I believe by replacing the image, it's just going to be changing the image to something completely different, like an actual button. So let go, it's going to change it back. If I let go, then the ID 9716444, something very interesting that I don't know if you've ever noticed, that if you've ever seen this before. But if we have this button image, we can see that it's an ID of 9716444, just like a bunch of random numbers here. If I press the button, then it's going to change the ID to something different. If I let go, then the ID is going to change back to 444. So if I press it, it's going to change the image to something that's a little bit brighter, and then let go, it's going to change it back to something else. So So I actually tested this by changing the image to something completely different, like an actual button. So if I search a button, and let's say I took one of these buttons and tried replacing the image, it's just going to be overridden with Roblox's default system of just changing the ID to this default button. And unfortunately, I believe there's no way around this exactly. You're gonna have to use a different framework created by someone that allows you to change the actual button itself. There is a feature for that. I don't exactly know what the name of it is, but if you want to know what it is, I'll probably post it in my resources channel in my Discord server. So if you haven't joined that, I highly recommend you join my Discord server. All right, and that's basically going to be the end of this episode. I hope you found this video to be extremely helpful to you and that you'll be using this in your Roblox games. If you want to know more about user input and how we can detect user input, and also how we can detect the device that the player's on, I highly recommend you watching my user input service video that I'm going to be putting in right here. So go and watch that if you haven't already. I hope you found this video to be helpful. And if you have, be sure to check out all my other videos that I do have. Or
Okay, guys, so that's it for today. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.